Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, sponsored by the Council of State Governments Justice Center in partnership with the Bureau of Justice Assistance in the U.S. Department of Justice. Today's webinar will focus on the FY14 solicitation for the Comprehensive Community-Based Adult Reentry Program utilizing mentors. Before I introduce our speaker, a couple of technical notes. After the presentation, we should have plenty of time for questions and answers. You can submit a question at any time during the webinar by typing your question in the Q&A panel that appears in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. If you encounter connection or audio problems during the webinar, technical support is available from WebEx, our webinar vendor, at the following phone number, 866-229-3239. Unfortunately, there are some technical problems that we may not be able to resolve during today's webinar, but for that reason, we are recording the webinar and we'll send an email to all of the registered attendees later this week or early next week when that recording is available online. Our speaker list is a little shorter than it appears on your screen. Our speaker today is Dr. Gary Dennis, Senior Policy Advisor for Corrections at the Bureau of Justice Assistance. Dr. Dennis joined BJA after a 34-year career with the Kentucky Department of Corrections. And since joining BJA, Dr. Dennis has overseen the implementation of the Second Chance Act, as well as a number of other high-priority initiatives for the Department of Justice. We're very grateful to Dr. Dennis for finding time in his busy schedule to lead today's webinar. Before I introduce Dr. Dennis, I'll give you just a little bit of background about the Second Chance Act for those of you who aren't familiar. The Second Chance Act was signed into law in April 2008, and grant programs have been funded since 2009. The Second Chance Act authorizes grants to state, local, and tribal governments and nonprofit organizations to support programs, policies, and practices that are intended to reduce recidivism. In fiscal year 2014, $67.7 million was appropriated for Second Chance Act grant programs. Funding will be distributed between adult and juvenile grant programs and across solicitations. There are currently 3 other FY14 Second Chance Act solicitations that are currently open. The Second Chance Act two-phase adult reentry demonstration program, which encompasses both a planning and implementation phase, has been released. We are going to be doing a webinar on this solicitation this Friday at 2 p.m. So if you haven't heard about or registered for that webinar and you're interested in participating, please visit our website and you'll be able to register there. There are also 2 juvenile-focused solicitations that have been issued by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. The first is a 2-phase juvenile reentry demonstration program that's comparable to the adult demonstration solicitation. The second solicitation that has been issued on the juvenile side is a comprehensive statewide juvenile reentry systems reform planning program, which is intended to foster planning projects at both the state level as well as the county level that target juvenile recidivism through the use of evidence-based practices and assessment-driven case management. If you're not currently on the National Reentry Resource Center's newsletter list, we do send out announcements anytime that new Second Chance Act solicitations are posted. We also regularly send out announcements for webinars like this one. You can sign up for the NRRC newsletter at our website, which appears on the screen in front of you. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Dennis to walk through the requirements of the solicitation. Gary?
Thanks very much, Leah. Just a little bit of history. Leah mentioned the fact that the Second Chance Act was signed into law in 2008, and the BJA received the first appropriation for Second Chance programming in federal fiscal year 09. That particular appropriation included money, $15 million for comprehensive demonstration projects, and also $10 million for funding Section 211 mentoring grants to private nonprofits. The mentoring grants are the only section, as it stands now, of the Second Chance Act that are open exclusively to private nonprofits, 501c3 organizations. This is the 6th year that we have done a mentoring solicitation, and we decided to do something a little bit different with this particular solicitation. It still focuses on using mentors to help facilitate effective reentry for formerly incarcerated individuals Applicants still are limited to nonprofit organizations, including tribal nonprofit organizations, as well as federally recognized Indian tribes. The applicants must have a documented history of providing comprehensive evidence-based reentry services. Honestly, what we're looking for are larger private nonprofits who have just been able to do exactly what I said, and that is to provide documentation that they can provide comprehensive services. This particular solicitation, the applications are due by midnight on June the 2nd, and you'll see from the slide that there is a link where you can see the actual solicitation. So I mentioned that we decided to do things a little bit differently this year, and that means that, number one, we're going to make larger awards, where in the past the awards have been for roughly $300,000 for 2 years. We're going to make larger awards of up to $1 million for a 36-month period. We're looking for private nonprofits who will be able to provide a full menu of wraparound services to facilitate reentry that have the capacity to serve a minimum of 250 individuals over the 36-month award period. And again, the first 5 iterations of this particular solicitation required that mentoring had to be the core service, and that relationship was established pre-release through an agreement with a Department of Corrections, a state Department of Corrections, or a local Department of Corrections, and the private nonprofit only had to provide one post-release reentry service. It could have been housing, it could have been substance abuse counseling, it could have been mental health counseling, it could have been assistance with finding and keeping a job. But this particular solicitation envisions a complete menu of services. Most of the folks who are coming out who are moderate or high-risk offenders are going to have a whole panoply of needs. They're probably going to have some co-occurring disorders, substance abuse, mental health. They'll probably be needing housing with supportive case management. So what we're looking for are organizations that are able to establish a mentoring relationship prior to release, but also to provide a complete range of services. This is going to require very strong collaboration with a Department of Corrections, primarily for 2 reasons. One, to get referrals for the program of folks who are being released, being able to identify them prior to release so that the mentoring relationship can be established, and more importantly, making sure that the Department of Corrections, whether a state department or a local department that the applicant is going to be working with, uses a validated risk needs assessment. The target population, and I know, Leah, you're very good at this year. I'm sure you're advancing the slides along with me. The target population is adults 18 years of age or older who have been convicted as an adult and imprisoned in a state, local, tribal prison or jail. Again, the application has got to identify the number of participants that the applicant intends to serve, but a minimum of 250 during the 36-month period. And I've already mentioned the fact that the target population needs to be moderate to high risk of a reoffending as a result of having been evaluated by a validated risk needs assessment. Now, there are some mandatory requirements for this solicitation. These are not priority consideration. These are items that must be a part of the application. The first is to demonstrate a cost-effective strategy to serve the minimum of 250 clients. Second is the inclusion of a memorandum of agreement between the applicant agency and a state or local Department of Corrections, which guarantees access to offenders to be able to establish that pre-release mentoring relationship, as well as a process for referring folks, offenders, returning offenders, to the program based on their risk level. Again, the applicant has got to demonstrate how they're going to be able to provide pre- and post-release services. The pre-release services primarily establishing the mentoring relationship and helping work with the Department of Corrections, not only to determine the risk level, moderate or high, but also what the needs of the folks are who are going to be returning. And describe a comprehensive menu of transitional services that incorporates what we refer to as evidence-based practices, and generally speaking, cognitive behavioral programs. The next slide talks about the fact that the successful applicants will talk about the number of mentors that they intend to recruit. The successful application should provide the peer reviewers with an outline of the training curriculum that they will use to provide training and to prepare the mentors to work with these clients, not again just prior to release in terms of establishing a relationship, but to be there as a support to them, as an adjunct to the provision of the menu of wraparound services. There also needs to be a plan for tracking outcomes as a result of the involvement of an offender in this particular program for at least 12 months. And probably one of the most important mandatory requirements is the ability of the applicant to be able to establish and document a baseline recidivism rate so that they will be able to project, hopefully, some very positive and realistic reductions in recidivism as a result of people participating in the program. Now, there are two priority considerations. Again, these are not mandatory requirements, but they are certainly factors that the peer reviewers and VJA will look at from a positive light. One is being able to provide a plan to demonstrate the ability to identify and to hopefully get offenders who are returning signed up for expanded Medicare and insurance coverage under the Affordable Care Act, and the other would be to provide an independent evaluation of the project. The next criteria talks about, or slide talks about selection criteria. The statement of the problem accounts for 15%, program design implementation 35%. This is a very important one. The capabilities and competencies of the organization, 25%. The successful applicants will outline their design for being able to identify in conjunction with a Department of Corrections the offenders prior to release, and also they should be able to outline how they intend to provide this menu of wraparound services upon release, and they need to demonstrate that their organization has the capability and the competencies to do what they say they're going to do. So my best guess is that we're talking about relatively mature and very experienced private nonprofits who are not now just deciding to wade into this interesting field. 15% impacts and outcomes, and then 10% of the selection criteria will be based on the budget. I'm not going to go into great detail on the next slides. The statement of the problem it basically is that it's the ability of the applicant to articulate the issues and barriers which relate to the particular target population that they have chosen. Also, for the applicant to be able to articulate in their program narrative how the menu of services that they're going to provide upon release will hopefully help improve the ability of these offenders to successfully re-enter society. Again, program design and implementation, basically saying what it is that the applicant proposes to do, and then the next slide after that talks again about the capabilities and competencies of the applicant organization. In other words, why is it that a peer reviewer or a BJA should understand that this particular organization is going to be able to serve 250 clients and to provide that wraparound menu of reentry services. Impact and outcomes, we just want to be able to determine if there is hopefully a positive impact from this particular application of funds. The impacts and outcome section is continued. Very important is the budget. Again, these grants are going to be for $1 million for a 36-month or a 3-year grant period. One thing about the Second Chance Act that I'm sure a lot of you all who have applied already or maybe second chance grantees understand is that the flexibility of the Second Chance Act money is very broad in terms of what the funds can be used for, allowable expenses. About the only thing that they can't be used for are to provide cash payments as incentives or gift cards or to purchase vehicles or things like that. But other than those few restrictions and some restrictions on the size of conferences and meetings, the Second Chance Act money can be used very liberally. As an example, Second Chance grant funds could be used to subsidize wages and employment. They could be used to subsidize housing in terms of rental or even to help pay for not a down payment but a deposit on housing. They also can be used to help an offender remove barriers to their reentry. And we're not talking about suing the government, but for instance, if an offender is having trouble getting a job because of inequities in the employment system, that it could be that Second Chance money could be used to pay for legal advice to help them overcome those barriers. As is with most of our Second Chance grants, there will be a set of performance metrics that will be provided in the, actually I think they're already in the solicitation, but we will work through those to further refine them. There's a slide that talks about basic minimum requirements. This is what we refer to as BMR. Basically, our first look at the applications will be to determine whether all of those mandatory requirements are met and whether the application is complete, that it includes an abstract, it includes a program narrative, it includes a budget detail worksheet as well as a budget narrative. And I didn't mention earlier, but I think it was pointed out in the slide, there are no matching funds required for this grant solicitation. So the agency does not have to come up with any additional money. Again, the required attachments that are provided, project timeline, position descriptions for key positions and resumes, letters of support, and again, the memorandum of agreement, particularly with the Department of Corrections, our local correctional agency, and any other organizations that the applicant may be subcontracting with to provide the services, those should be included. If I remember correctly, the grant management system, grants.gov, that you will be submitting your application through, does not prohibit the number of attachments that can be submitted. In some cases, the size of the files may be limited. But I would strongly encourage you, if you're interested in applying for this, to make sure that you carefully craft your program narrative, that you carefully craft your budget detail worksheet and your budget narrative, because other than looking for evidence of a bona fide memorandum of understanding or agreement, those three particular documents are the most important. Our peer reviewers are going to place the most significance and the most importance on those. You have the contact information for BJA, as well as Leah has pointed out to you, technical assistance that is available through the National Reentry Resource Center. The National Reentry Resource Center cannot help write your grant for you, but they have tremendous resources that will help prepare you to write the grant. They have lots of information online about evidence-based programming, about programs and strategies that we know work. And they also have an interactive map on the National Reentry Resource Center website that will provide you information about other Second Chance Act grants, mentoring grants, or demonstration grants, or co-occurring grants that have been awarded. So that is really, in a nutshell, what I had to say about the solicitation. Leah, I think we can now open the floor for questions, unless you'd like to make some additional comments.
Nope, I've got just a handful of questions. If there's anybody who hasn't submitted a question yet, who has any questions, please submit it to the Q&A box. We've got quite a bit of time to cover Q&A. And as I'm asking questions, if I don't, Dr. Dennis can't see the questions as you submitted them. So if I'm not asking the question exactly the way that you needed to get the answer, please submit that in the Q&A box as well, and I can ask the follow-up question. Okay, so Gary's first question, can the grant be used to provide support to federal prisoners or people returning from the federal system?
Generally, no. The money that we that's appropriated to the Bureau of Justice Assistance is designated for supporting state and local offenders returning back. And the reason that's the case is because the Federal Bureau of Prisons gets a separate second chance grant or second chance appropriation to take care of federal offenders. Now, realistically, if you have a large program where you're going to be able to serve 250 offenders, and there may be 2 or 3 federal prisoners who are returning to a particular community, and the applicant can establish some type of relationship with the federal facility, correctional institution where those folks are going to be leaving. We have been a little bit flexible in terms of allowing some federal offenders to be served by our second chance programs. But generally speaking, the answer is no. These are to target state and local returning offenders, not feds.
Okay. Is it allowable for applicants to propose setting aside funding for gift cards as an incentive for follow-up tracking of participants?
Actually, no. That is an area that is very murky, and we just encourage folks to stay away from gift cards. The only area like that we think is a safe area is if you are able to give a transit card or something that would help pay for their transportation to and from the job or to involved therapy. But just gift cards as incentives are not allowed.
I am switching over to a slide, Gary, which you can't see, but we got a question asking if you could talk a little bit more about the second priority consideration, which is to provide for an independent evaluation of the project that includes, to the maximum extent feasible, random assignments of offenders to program delivery and control groups. Can you give folks any more advice about the size of the evaluation, if it has to be random assignment, or just any feedback you can give them about what that evaluation needs to look like?
It does not have to be random assignment, primarily because we know that random assignment, what's referred to as the gold standard of evaluation, is extremely expensive, and that would eat up a large chunk of the money, the grant money, to pay for that type of an evaluation. If I were getting involved in this, I would probably put some feelers out to a local college or university and see if there were folks there that would be willing to work with me to provide a qualitative evaluation of the program, perhaps to develop sort of a quasi-experimental design that would allow the offenders in the program to be tracked. So we're not talking about a very rigorous and comprehensive evaluation. I wish we could, but we funded through the National Institute of Justice a random controlled trial experiment for 7 of our first 15 second chance grantees that were made the very first year, and this is a project that costs several millions of dollars and has lasted for 3 years. So the important thing here is to try to find an organization. Again, it could be a private contractor, but it's probably more likely that you should reach out to a public university or someone there that is sort of an unbiased, not sort of, but that is an unbiased third party that will work with you to design what I would continue to refer to as sort of a quasi-experimental design for the project. So we understand that this is not something that we're going to get the gold standard for, but we do anticipate and hope that folks will be creative and allow a reasonable portion of the $1 million grant to support funding research and evaluation that will hopefully indicate that there were very positive results from the program.
I have a question about letters of support versus memorandums of understanding versus memorandum of agreement. among the, I think that the solicitation says you'd like letters of support from all of the key partners, but then memorandums of understanding or agreement from the corrections agencies, right? Is there a preference for a specific form of support from particular partners, or can the applicant submit sort of whichever version is easiest for them to obtain?
Well, I think that therein sort of lies the problem, particularly with the mentoring projects over the last several years. We have had applicants who have had letters of support from, let's say, a state Department of Corrections saying, you know, if you get this grant, we'll allow you access to the offenders and behind the walls, and we'll help you determine what their risk and needs level are. And what happens is when the folks get the grant, the Department of Corrections says, oh, well, we really didn't mean it. You know, we were just trying to be nice, and so we gave you this letter of support. So when it comes to a relationship with a Department of Corrections where you're getting referrals for your program, where you're having to depend upon them to allow you access to the offenders behind the walls for 30, 45, 90 days prior to release, and where you're having to depend upon them to provide referrals based on a validated risk needs assessment, then you must have not just a letter of support, not just a, well, we think we'll do this for you, but you have to have a contract, if you will, which is what a memorandum of understanding is. Now, if the applicant agency is looking to subcontract with other private nonprofits in the field to provide post-release services, let's say a comprehensive mental health center to provide drug treatment and or mental health treatment, or a public housing authority to provide housing, we would be willing to look at just letters of support or letters of commitment, primarily because these folks, if you've talked with them and you talk, they have something to gain. You're going to be subcontracting with them. You're going to be passing money through to them. So it's more likely that a letter of commitment would suffice. But for the Corrections Department, it has to be a contract. It has to be a memorandum of agreement.
Gary, do you have a sense of how many grants you might award under this section?
We actually, it's obviously because of the large nature of the grant, larger than it probably will be, I'm hoping, somewhere between 5 and 7 grants. But it will not be a whole large number, but let's just say between 5 and 7.
Do mentors have to be volunteers, or can they be paid staff, or reimbursed in other ways?
Yes, they can be. The mentors can be either volunteers who are trained, or they can be compensated through a stipend, or in some instances they actually could be paid staff.
For an applicant that is working with a target population coming out of a local jail, is there a required minimum duration that the participants have to have been incarcerated for?
No. I think that they need to have been incarcerated for a period of time that is long enough for the applicant agency to be able to have a mentoring relationship established. I guess I have to think that anywhere from 30 to 90 days would be ideal, but you want the mentor that is paired up with the returning offender to have time to visit that person behind the wall several times and to begin to develop the relationship that we hope then will be very supportive once that offender is released into the community. But there's no specific number that we cite in the solicitation.
I've got a series of questions about allowable uses for grant funds, and so let me give those to you in order if I can cluster them all together. The first pertains to staff salaries.
Yes, staff salaries are allowable.
Okay. What about work experience wages and credential training costs?
That would be allowable also.
We've got an applicant who's interested in putting together a one-stop training infrastructure for a Department of Corrections where they would recruit, train, monitor, and manage mentors. And so they'd be putting together the infrastructure for that training and support program. Is that an allowable use?
I don't think that would be a strong application because what we're really seeing as that type of infrastructure as being just a small part of the overall project. And in fact, when I mentioned earlier the whole issue of competencies and capabilities of the organization, we're probably realistically looking at large private nonprofits who already have that type of training program for their volunteers in place if they're going to be competitive for these grants. But more than that, that sounds to me like, and I certainly would be willing to talk with this person. They can call me or we can do email back and forth. But it sounds to me like that really what that money would be used would be to fund the development of that infrastructure. And what we're really interested in is the bulk of the funds actually going to provide services to help effectuate reentry.
Above and beyond the mentoring program specifically, are there any limitations in terms of the kinds of services that applicants can propose to fund out of their program? We've got questions about mental health and alcohol and drug use assessments, employment services, a whole wide range of services.
Yeah, I think anything goes. We all know that folks who are coming back, it's hard for me being, as long as I've been in the business, Leah, you know this because we've been around each other for a while, to not tell war stories. It used to be in Kentucky, where I worked for 35 years of my career, that when someone came before the parole board, they asked them two questions. Do you have a job? And they would hopefully say yes, but they didn't ask them what kind of job, McDonald's, and then they would ask them, do you have a place to live? And we know that just having a job and having a place to live is not enough, because a lot of folks need supportive housing services, case management services as a part of the housing to help them to keep the housing stable, as well as with jobs. If they have a problem with alcohol or a problem with drugs, then they're not going to be able to hold down a job. So I think that we know that there are very few offenders who come out, particularly if they're moderate to high risk, that are just going to need one level of service. So I think the short answer is that the second chance money can be used for just about any of that. Employment preparation, employment, and helping a person to keep the job, housing, case management services around housing, drug treatment, mental health treatment, really any of those services that are going to facilitate and help enhance the likelihood of success on reentry.
Are there any restrictions on using grant funds to purchase technology to support programming, job training, and job placement?
Actually, no. I would certainly have to be careful because we're going to be looking at multifaceted programs. So if it seems apparent from the application that was submitted that the applicant was focusing primarily just on employment-related skills, and that they were spending a significant amount of the money for purchase of technology training, then that would probably make them less competitive because there are other sources of funds, i.e. the Department of Labor and the one-stop shops there that federal government funds that do that. So while using the funds for those kinds of services are not, would be allowable, certainly you have to also think about how competitive is your program going to be in terms of being able to be almost all things to all people.
Gary, are there any limitations on faith-based programs? Are faith-based programs allowed to apply, and are there any restrictions on spending money for those programs?
Well, actually, no. Faith-based organizations are encouraged to apply as long as they have the 501c3 status. The standard protocols apply. The fact that the federal dollars cannot be used to evangelize or proselytize or to put forward any type of religious philosophy. You've got to make sure that you keep the religion separate from the programs. But we actually strongly encourage faith-based organizations to apply. That's been one of the strengths of the mentoring program for the last 5 years under Second Chance. Of course, I'm guessing that most folks who are listening on this webinar certainly know that President Obama has made that a strong priority on his Office of Faith-Based and Community Development. And so we work very closely with the White House and with the faith-based person that is embedded in each one of the cabinet agencies. So the short answer is no restrictions. Encourage that. The only thing that a faith-based organization or any smaller private nonprofit has got to be aware of is that, again, as I said earlier, being able to have the capabilities and competencies to provide in a quality fashion, in an evidence-based fashion, all of these reentry services.
Gary, are there any provisions for indemnification of risk, specifically for sex offender practitioners?
Actually, no, not through this federal program. I would think that anyone who is working in the service sector would probably be smart to either have insurance coverage through the organization if that was possible, or certainly to carry private malpractice insurance. But that's not something that this particular grant solicitation would take into consideration. But having been director of mental health for the Department of Corrections for several years in Kentucky, we do know that sex offenders are considered to be a priority population. We know it's extremely difficult to provide services for those folks. But there would have to, in terms of indemnification and protection, that's something that would have to be worked out either with the parent organization or through individual service providers providing their own liability insurance.
When do you anticipate making awards?
Well, that's a good question. The applications are due June the 2nd. We have a peer review process. I think most folks on the webinar probably understand how that works. We will assign, depending on the number of applications that we have, we'll probably assign 15 applications to panels of 3 peer reviewers. People should hear, if they're going to receive a grant, they should hear late August, early September, primarily because all of our money has to be, quote, out the door, unquote, by the end of September, which is the end of the federal fiscal year. So I would say you'll hear probably early in September.
We have a question about the disclosure of pending applications, and I'm going to try to find that slide just so I can put it up for everybody.
I really don't understand that, and I'm a part of the organization. I think that there's just, our folks have gotten, well, I shouldn't say this in the webinar, but have gotten so bureaucratized that they wouldn't like to know if the applicant agency is applying for any additional federal funding, maybe a large SAMHSA grant or a labor grant. But I want to point out the fact that is not going to disqualify you. You may have an application in for a Department of Labor grant. You may have an application in for a SAMHSA grant. You actually may have an application in under one of our other solicitations for a comprehensive reentry program. So it's not going to disqualify you. That's just a bit of information that some of our folks somewhere up the food chain needs to know or wants to know. Does that make any sense, Leah?
Yeah, and the question that came in was whether they need to disclose applications for similar services, so, any applications for funding for reentry, or does it need to be for the exact same target population? Do you have any sense of sort of like what the parameters are in terms of what they consider to be the same project?
I'm so sorry, but I really can't answer that. I would just simply say that perhaps err on the side of cautiousness, and if you had an application in for with another federal agency or with BJA for any type of reentry and related programming, it would probably be a good idea to mention that.
Okay. If any of the folks on the webinar are current recipients of Second Chance Act grants, are they eligible to apply under this solicitation?
Yes, they are.
Are there any specific populations that you would either recommend or not recommend being part of the target population for this grant? And we specifically got questions about veterans and sex offenders.
Well, actually, again, returning veterans are a priority population, particularly folks who may have issues related to PTSD or traumatic brain injuries. Also, as I mentioned earlier, returning sex offenders are a priority population because of the difficulty of those folks reintegrating into society. Just keep in mind that what we're looking for is making sure that the target population is clearly identified as moderate to high risk offenders through the use of a validated risk needs assessment like the LSI or something like that. So, but other than that, we don't. The other group of returning offenders that we've always looked at as being a priority population are female offenders returning, particularly female offenders with children, because that's another major initiative of President Obama is addressing problems related to children of incarcerated parents.
If an applicant under the mentoring solicitation knows of another agency that's submitting an application under another grant program, another Second Chance Act grant program, should they be concerned about that? Is there any provisions around like geographic diversity or anything like that that they need to be worried about?
No, they shouldn't worry about that. They should be much more concerned with developing a top-notch application that they shouldn't be worried about. They're obviously going to be competing. And the way our process works is that the 3 peer reviewers rate the applications. We have a consensus call, and then we look at the leadership of the Bureau of Justice Census looks at the final raw scores and draws a line, for instance, and there may be, let's say, the top 15 applications will be in Tier 1, and we can fund 7 out of that 15. But no, it's obviously competitive, but they shouldn't worry about other agencies that are applying. It's sort of a dog-eat-dog world out there.
We've got a series of questions that I think all reflect sort of the same concern, and it has to do with smaller nonprofits that perhaps that haven't been around as long and may or may not have their 501c3 status. So I'm going to sort of cluster these together. First, is 501c3 status required to apply under the solicitation?
Yes and no. The 501c3 designation, of course, is a designation that the Internal Revenue Service provides. If a particular organization does not have a 501c3 designation, they would have to have documentation from the Secretary of State or whatever in their particular state that they are recognized, let's say, in the state of California or the state of Indiana as a private nonprofit agency. So the cleanest, best way is for them to have the 501c3 because it's very rare that an organization is going to be able to get designated even in a local state as a private nonprofit and being tax exempt without the 501c3. And the other issue too is I've got to be honest with folks too that again you have a small private nonprofit that hasn't been in business very long. It's going to be extremely difficult for them to put together a competitive application to be able to develop the alliances to provide this full range of services. I'm not saying it can't be done, but it's particularly if they haven't been around long enough to have been granted 501c3. It may be a situation where they need to reevaluate their capabilities and competencies.
Okay. Along those lines, I just wanted to clarify for folks, this is the only solicitation that will come out this year that specifically funds mentoring or is specifically available to nonprofit organizations. Gary, do you have a sense whether future solicitations down the road might be open to smaller nonprofits that have been around for a shorter period of time?
Well, the reauthorization bill for the Second Chance Act that was introduced last year, and I don't know exactly where that is in terms of making its way through. In fact, you may know more about that than I do, Leah, because we're not allowed to, as a federal agency, to be involved in that. But I do understand that the reauthorization of Second Chance opens up the family-based treatment, the co-occurring disorders, as well as mentoring. It opens up, I think it's 4 additional sections of Second Chance to private nonprofits. But as it stands right now, the way the current legislation is written, this Section 211, the mentoring grant, is the only solicitation, the only area that's open exclusively to private nonprofits. Now, the way around that, of course, is partnering with a government agency, State Department of Corrections or local Department of Corrections, to be the applicant agency for the private nonprofit then to provide some of the reentry services. And that's what I'm talking about for a comprehensive demonstration project on reentry, not this particular solicitation.
Gary, do you have any preference for group mentoring versus individual mentoring, and is there any cap on the number of individuals that could be mentored by one individual?
The answer to that's no. I think that would just be dictated by good practice. There's very little research, actual honest-to-goodness research out there on the efficacy and effectiveness of mentoring. And group mentoring, individual mentoring, they all have value. From my perspective, as working in the field for a long time, is that the real key here is the kind of selection process that an agency goes through to select their mentors, and how they train them, and how they supervise them when they're actually involved in the mentoring. But the answer to that particular question is no, there really aren't any preferences on the part of BJA in terms of evaluating the applications.
In terms of matching up the organization that provides the mentoring and the organizations that might provide the transitional services, is there a preference for which of those organizations is the primary applicant under this grant program? In other words, is there a preference for having the primary applicant be the organization that provides the mentoring versus having the primary organization having the capacity to provide the full range of comprehensive services? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I know. It does make sense. And I think that the answer to the question is no, there really isn't a preference. In other words, if the organization that was going to provide the mentoring was not the organization that provided the bulk of the post-release services, but they had a strong agreement to work together, I think that's fine. The agency, the private nonprofit that is going to provide the mentoring does not have to be the applicant agency.
Okay, we've got a series of questions that relate to when participants are enrolled in the program and how long they need to be in the program before they are released. So, first one, is there a minimum sort of program length that you have in mind? Are you anticipating that folks will be involved in the program for 3 months, 6 months, or 12 months, et cetera?
I think the short answer is no. I think it needs to be based on that individual's need and their level of progression. So I would not set rigid cutoff dates to say that a person has, quote, completed the program after they've been there for 6 months. I think that there are some cases when someone could be involved with the program and be receiving some level of services and be able to live independently in 3 months. In some cases, it might be 18 months. So no, there's no magic number there. It's really going to depend on effective evaluation and individualization of a treatment plan for the folks that are coming out.
Could inmates be released prior to the awarding of the grant and be enrolled in the program after they've already been released?
No.
Okay. So you'd like to see everybody released after the organization receives the award, right?
That's correct.
Okay. Okay. We have a question from an applicant who has a contract with a corrections agency that prohibits them from contacting offenders following release. Presumably that they would not be able to use those offenders that they aren't able to contact post-release as their target population for this grant.
That's correct. It sounds to me like that they're in a catch-22 and they would not be able to put together a viable application.
When it comes to putting together a budget, should the applicants should they list every provider that they're planning on contracting with under the grant, or just list the broad categories that they plan to contract under? In other words, would you like to see, $40,000 to provider X, $100,000 to provider Y, or would you rather just see the broad categories that they'll be contracting with?
I think the strongest and the most competitive applications are going to be the ones where the individual providers are already identified and where a budget figure can be attached to that subcontract. And if I were doing it, then I would actually make sure that as an attachment to the application there was information about the again, capabilities and competencies of the subcontractees there. So yeah, the most competitive applications are going to be ones where those relationships are already established in their firm, and there's some clear documentation that the organizations that are going to be subcontracted with are able to handle the work.
I've got a few questions about the size of the jurisdiction that an applicant proposes. So, are there any guidelines or any advice you give folks about submitting applications to provide services in smaller cities or in rural areas? Should the target population be of a sufficient size, anything like that?
Well, I think the real issue there is that we are very concerned about the fact that the applicant would be able to clearly establish the fact that they're going to be able to serve a minimum of 250 medium to high-risk offenders during the 3 years of the grant. So it stands to reason that a larger jurisdiction that they have a relationship with, that would be easier to do.
Are there any guidelines around peer mentoring? Can folks propose peer mentors for their program?
Yes, they can.
Just to clarify, government entities cannot be the submitting agency. So the applicant has to be a nonprofit.
That's correct.
Right. Okay. Can Skype or video mentoring be used in rural areas to start the mentoring relationship?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I am a touchy-feely person, and I think that would be problematic, to be honest with you. I've never been a real fan of video visiting, so that's just my personal opinion. Is there a prohibition against it? No, there isn't. But I think that would have to be something that would have to be very carefully thought out by the applicant, and there would have to be the ability to demonstrate that there was going to be the ability for the mentor and the mentee to establish a personal linkage and not just through something over video. But the answer is no, there's no prohibition against that.
Can applicants set aside money for mentor-mentee activities?
That's very tricky, and I really am probably going to say no, that would be something that would be very, well, it could be, I would steer clear of that. That's an area that could be determined to be unallowable. So I think not.
What about, there's a category of things that we often refer to as sort of basic needs, but we have a lot of organizations that help with boots, for example, or tools or clothing for individuals who are returning. Is that an allowable expense for grantees?
Yes, I think it is. If a person had been trained in a particular trade, if you will, and maybe the difference would be being able to provide them with a set of masonry tools or carpentry tools, that's just something that folks would have to be careful to be able to justify, but it's not something that would be automatically unallowable.
Yes. A couple of questions about the evaluation. Would a state DOC study of participant outcomes be considered an independent evaluation?
I think you could probably make a case for that, since the State Department of Corrections would probably only be involved to the point of being able to, or recommending offenders based on the risk and needs assessment for placement in the program. I would prefer to see a university or college or some entity that was not as closely identified with the project, but I think I would not arbitrarily rule out a Department of Corrections, particularly if they had a very strong evaluation unit that had a demonstrated history of being able to do this type of work with integrity.
A preference for public universities versus private universities, or is any evaluation?
No, I think the evaluation part, it could be public or private.
Okay. I haven't been able to get through all the questions. I want to thank all of our audience members for submitting many questions. I hope we've gotten through most of them. If we didn't get to your question, feel free to send me an email afterwards, and I can forward those over to Dr. Dennis if it's something that we weren't able to address during the webinar. I want to finish up with just one question, and we've got a ton of questions from organizations that are basically sort of trying to feel out what qualifies a larger and well-established, if there's like a baseline for what makes somebody a larger or well-established nonprofit, so that they know whether they should apply or they're wasting their time. In terms of the size of the agency's budget, or the number of staff that they have on hand, or how long they've been running programs, can you give folks any guidance as to what you're looking for? And when they write applications, how should applicants demonstrate that they are a large and well-established organization?
Well, excuse me. I think that past history is the best predictor of future behavior. So if you have an organization like the Fortune Society or the Safer Foundation or Goodwill or Volunteers of America or the Salvation Army or some of these large organizations that really have a national presence that have been doing this kind of work for years, again, I think it's just like experience when a lot of us apply for a job. We have to list on our resume or our Vita, our experience, and that's what I would look for. I think that's what the peer reviewers will look for is, does the applicant and the subcontractors that they propose to use, do they have a track record? Do they have the documented experience? Have they been doing this long enough for them to develop expertise? I would envision that when it gets down to the final decisions, that in this particular case, since we're probably only going to make $5 to $7 million awards, that we would actually call and check references, if you will, about organizations in the community to see if we end up with, let's say, 15 applicants that score high enough to be in Tier 1, we're only going to make 7 awards. As part of the process of determining which of those 15 get the awards, there will probably be some phone calls made and some checking around to see if the particular organization has the reputation and has the history to do the work. I know that may sound a little harsh, but it's just a fact of life.
Great. Well, I know we weren't able to get to everyone's question, but I posted my email address, and if we didn't get to your question during the webinar, you're welcome to send me an email, and if I can't answer it myself, I'll ask Dr. Dennis to weigh in. I'd like to thank the Bureau of Justice Assistance for co-sponsoring today's webinar, and I'd like to especially thank Dr. Gary Dennis for leading the webinar, helping us put together slides, and answering as many questions as I think we've ever answered in a webinar, especially in a half an hour of time. After today's webinar ends, a survey will pop up on your screen requesting your feedback about the webinar. Please do provide any feedback you have. We review and pay attention to all the feedback that we get. Thanks very much, and good luck on your applications.
Thank you.